by going back and looking at Fiske, by looking at Washington Gladden, and I want to begin to look at another strand that comes out of the 19th century. I want to look at how that impacts social Darwinism, imperialism, race, and some of the other concepts that emerge at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. That sound like a plan? Okay. I find Fiske to be very interesting, in part because you would think that someone who is clearly Darwinian, emphasis on clearly Darwinian, would follow a path that would take him away from religion and more toward science. This is a passage early in his work, one of his collected essays that I think is particularly important for where I want to go today and perhaps next week. Note number one, that the creation of humans is the goal towards which all nature from the beginning intended. The glorious consummation of nature's long and tedious work. The conclusion and the chief among God's creatures. So let's look at that. What can you imply or what can you infer from that paragraph? Well, if you contrast it with Darwin, is there any mention of God and Darwin directly in The Descent of Man or The Origin of the Species? No. No. So think about this passage in terms of Edward Herbert. Herbert's primary point was that any a priori definition of what it means to be human is doomed to failure. His enterprise works only if there is an objective reality. There is no objective reality unless there is an intentionality. Let me go through that again. We know from what we've said that what ultimately doomed Herbert and gave rise to utilitarianism was the misplaced assumption that observation of nature would in some way show that there is an objective, intelligible reality. The world could not be arbitrary. Are we clear about that? However, observation of the world might yield some sense of laws of the universe if humans are so inclined to follow them. But it does not yield an objective definition of what it means to be human. Is that clear? Okay. If we think about Darwin's enterprise in terms of Herbert, then by anchoring humans in evolution in some shape or form, he's answering Edward Herbert. I'll go through that again. Either there is a human nature that we can derive from observation, or there isn't a human nature. That was the gamble. And Herbert assumed that at some point we would discover an objective human nature by looking at the way humans are. It failed. But you can think about Darwin as providing the anchor point, insofar as once you establish humans as the end of evolution, then you can objectively define humans in terms of evolution. Does that make sense? So I think it's particularly interesting that when we think about Darwin, the implication is that natural selection is an immutable law, not open to debate. And as a consequence of that, this process is not arbitrary. Does this make sense? Again, this is a particularly complex, obtuse point coming out of nowhere, but think about it for a second. While you're thinking about it, in an a priori definition of what it means to be human, I can assert that the function of being human is to know, love, and serve God. That humans are defined by intelligence, rationality, basically what Aristotle said plus Christianity. Correct? Okay. If you say that that is invalid, and you have to look to how humans behave in the world, coming to any kind of consensus becomes extremely difficult. So where do we go? Do we ultimately argue that there is no human nature? Well, in some respects, the rise of utilitarianism does exactly that. We don't know what it means to be human, but we know what all humans like. They want to be happy. So we define the good in terms of the generation of happiness. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes, is that a question or no? Okay, but if I say that humans are the product of evolution, particularly when I argue that natural selection is a law of the universe, it might appear to be arbitrary. But it isn't.
So does this come together with the two?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the conversation we had last week when we looked at Lamarck, then Darwin, following Lamarck, is going to argue that there is an upward motion which is driven by complexity and a lateral motion by the need to be adaptive. Yep, exactly. Uh-huh. Make sense? Okay. And natural selection for Darwin is very much both of those things. If you think about the adaptive part, remember we talk about the Darwinian triple helix. Humans compete against all life forms for survival. What became racial competition in the 19th century, human subspecies compete against other human subspecies. And the third, within a given society, natural selection is also real. Right? Make sense? Okay. We may not know the exact formula, but the drive towards complexity and the drive towards adaptive behavior are clearly fueling the process for Darwin. Shall I go through that again, or does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's look at the implications. It's not an accident that Darwin calls his book on human evolution The Descent of Man. I can't tell you for sure that what I'm about to say is tenable within the corpus of Darwinian work. But there is a sense in which Darwin removes humans from the pinnacle of perceived value in the natural world. To go back to a point that I keep making in my Elements of Research class, humans don't think in a vacuum, nor do they think thoughts that are separate from the way they live their lives. In some shape or form, they're all tied together. If we briefly review Darwin's life, we know that in some respects he's caught between his mother, who is religiously very conservative, and his grandfather, who's about as rebellious as you can possibly get to the point of being a Unitarian. And we see over the course of Darwin's life that his religious beliefs oscillate between more conservative periods at the end of his life and very close to atheism in the middle of his life. So when I read Darwin talking about the ascent of man, or the descent of man, I think of it in terms of a kind of stripping away of the presuppositions of Christian theology. To the point where humans are nothing but a biological entity, nothing special. There is no mention anywhere in the Darwinian corpus, as far as I know, of the concept of soul. I think what's particularly interesting, and as we transition to Fiske momentarily, hopefully this will become clearer, is the assumption that the difference in humans is a kind of incompleteness. We've talked about this in world religions, we've talked about it in philosophy. With complexity, instinct diminishes. Assuming humans are at the end of the evolutionary process, then we are the least instinctive of all. Okay, are there questions so far? Okay. To go back to a comment that we made last week, and which has come up several times in my classes this week, the implication is clearly that society is the answer to the missing parts. And that's why I don't think it's an accident that sympathy is an incredibly important part of the generation or the genesis of morality for Darwin. There's a kind of inward focus, a sense of apartness from the physical world. I want to make it clear that I don't think that this is specifically Darwin's invention. We're already picking up hints of it in Lamarck. It is clearly a concern for Spencer. We see it a bit later in Ward and in others. And if I were to describe it, I would say it's a kind of transference of responsibility.
Sympathies.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's as though all of a sudden natural selection turns to humans and says, now it's your problem. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So one of the ideas that we're picking up very strongly very early in the 19th century is this idea that humans are the end, the intended purpose. Of evolution. Here, I wish I had better words, but the essence of the problem comes down to we either assume responsibility or else. Ward says very clearly that or else is famine, pestilence, in modern terms, pandemic, war, natural selection will take back responsibility for humans. Okay, are there thoughts so far? And is this making sense? Okay, I wish I could draw. Unfortunately, I am tabletless. Next week, we will have a new tablet. So, this becomes the justification.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, question so far? Is this clear?
So in this part, you're saying that, well, the connection to applying social evolution, that would be to the natural selection factor.
Right. Natural selection, which for other animals exists as a force in the natural world. For humans, natural selection becomes a social process. That's a good point. We should make that.
So basically, you're just saying that how animals and natural species have their natural selection and then, natural living habitat. That for humans, that natural selection and natural habitat would be socially.
Yes.
And that's because from the difference of humans and completeness that society is for instance.
That's right.
Society is like the social aspect of humans.
That's right.
Do that. Then that's where the social evolution is basically.
Yes.
Which is where I want to get rid of kind of
Yes.
stuff in the technological aspects of things.
Right. And if you go even deeper, there's a kind of strange, instead of God, we have natural selection. And there's almost a consciousness to natural selection. There's a sense in which the creation of humans was intended from the beginning of creation. I want to be careful about the word intended. Foregone conclusion, inevitable, might be better words. But evolution clearly let me try a different way to put this. Evolution clearly is rational in the sense that it is not arbitrary or accidental in some respects. As I'm thinking about it, if you go back to our conversation about Hegel and the concept of Geist guiding history, inevitably for Hegel, Geist will reach its end in the full consciousness and freedom of all humans. How it gets there might be open to interpretation and open to some measure of experimentation. In a way I hadn't really thought about before, natural selection and the process of evolution are similar. Inevitably, the result would be humans.
If you think about it in terms of religion, we talk about like the fall when the gods like basically scrap the humans that they made and like remake other ones or like the demigods or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a sense, the creation of humans in our world is so that God doesn't have to do any of the work, aka the almost extinction of Jews, slavery, and
Exactly.
sorts. So the freedom by Hegel's means could possibly mean freedom of whatever race or social class you are.
Exactly. Exactly. So if you think about natural selection being driven by a process of increasing complexity, then we can look at human societies from the perspective of complexity. So the more complex, the more evolutionary progress a culture has made. So comparatively speaking, the city of Paris in the 19th century versus a Maasai village, the conclusion would always be that Paris is higher on the evolutionary scale. Right? The more complex, the more advanced. That is a constant theme all the way across the 19th century. So when you apply that, then more complex societies represent the future of the human species. So when these people are literally tracking the extinction of indigenous populations, they fail to see the impact of things like alcohol, smallpox. All that they see is these people, subject to natural selection, will die out. There is no other conclusion, and they feel no moral qualms whatsoever. It's also why the taboo about interracial relationships becomes so serious in the 19th century. For a Caucasian to intermarry with an African results in a substandard species that hurts the chances of the Caucasian race surviving. Again, I know we know this, but for the sake of putting it within the context of this argument, sort of the way it goes. Okay? Questions so far? All right, let's go back to Fiske. For Fiske, behind natural selection is the hand of God. The intentionality of God underlies the whole of creation, living and non-living, all of it. And therefore, we can only regard the whole of creation as purposeful. As far as I'm concerned, Fiske is strongly influenced by the story of creation in Genesis. And his argument is similar to the concept of humans being created at the end. From the beginning, God intended to create humans. The only question was when God would do it. If you think about the conventional Baltimore Catechism, why did God create? God created in order that all humans know, love, and serve God. That becomes the point. So Fiske is evoking that same sense of intentionality that is at its roots extremely biblical. He also will link as far as I can tell, there's no mention in Fiske of any other life form being conscious. And in terms of the 19th century, it would be highly unusual to assume that any life force other than humans, life form, would be conscious. And consciousness is linked to the soul. So the argument then becomes that the whole point of evolution was for God to create humans. Conscious, sentient, and designed by God for God. Does that make sense? So, religion, in all of its shapes and forms, parallels the evolution of humans. So, the more complex a religion, the more advanced that religion is. And of course, that takes Fiske to one ultimate conclusion: Christianity. At this point, we're almost back to the world before Herbert. The hand of God is everywhere. Christianity is at the end of human evolution. We can view all other religions and cultures as deficient. Okay, questions so far? Thoughts so far? Making sense? Okay. This will pop up in very unexpected ways. So there will be a kind of return at multiple points to the relationship between all human species, subspecies, and Caucasians. One of the interesting turns we're going to see, there will be two variations on this. The first variation is going to focus on the story of Ham. And I know we've talked about it, but for the sake of review, Ham is the son of Noah. After the flood, Noah plants grapes. When he has his first harvest, Noah gets rip-roaring drunk, passes out on his bed, nude, face up. Ham walks in and sees his father nude. Shocked, he goes to get his brothers. They come in with a sheet, turning their backs to their father so they do not see him nude, at which point they cover him. When Noah wakes up, he says to him, Abad Abadim. To recall what we've said about Hebrew in the past, the singular followed by the plural is the equivalent of using the word very in English. But typically, that phrase is translated as and since all people of color are seen as the descendants of Ham, then this becomes biblical justification for slavery. A subset of this argument is that Ham is described as dark-skinned. Whichever direction, the argument then becomes that there is a fundamental distinction between Caucasians and all other, again, I hate the word, but races, which is supported biblically. And I'm sure you can think about the implications of that, and they would be that the other sons of Adam are white. So in the same way that humans are given dominion over the fish, the birds, and the earth, white humans are given dominion over all other human species. Is that clear? Okay. The second variation is that there were actually two parallel processes of human evolution. One, which is typified by people of color, essentially reduces them to hominids, human-like, but not human. The other parallel the sons of Adam. Why are they different? They have a soul. So as much as people of color might appear to be human, according to this line of argument, they're not. Okay, any questions so far? Any thoughts? Okay. Both of these become critical for the formation of social Darwinism in the 19th century. They also become critical for the formation of racism in the 19th century. And in some shape or form, though they are not articulated, they go all the way back to the beginning of slavery over 400 years ago. So to make it clear, these people are not inventing anything new. They are simply clarifying, bringing to a logical articulation what was already real in Western culture. Does that make sense? Okay. So what becomes interesting is that when Fiske combines Christianity and evolution, he's going to trigger another development in Western culture. So if we go back to the diagram we've looked at before, see if I can find it quickly in design syllabus. Well, we can get to it from here. So if we go here and we go to books and we call this up, we're down in here. So Fiske never really leaves Wallace Tate, Farrar, Gregg, and numerous others aside. He simply begins what with Washington Gladden we will call the social gospel. If you want to think of it as a less murderous form of social Darwinism, we can do that. But the net effect will still be very much the same. So before we go and take a closer look at Gladden, sort of the conclusion to Fiske, Gladden, becomes a school of thought like Josiah Strong. Josiah Strong said, if you want to really fix all the social problems, the answer is really simple. Make everyone Christian. And the implication is you can't be Christian unless you live in a European culture. So rather than extinction, you can think of this school of thought as absorption, conversion, jack up their culture, make them European, make them Christian. It'll all be better in the end. Okay, questions, thoughts? Okay. Let's spend a few minutes and take a look at this essay by Washington Gladden. The title of this essay assumes a relationship between Christianity and social science, and the study of this relation is the task before us. What do we mean by Christianity? What by social science? We shall take the word Christianity in its largest sense as signifying that form of social order whose organizing force is the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Let's go through that again. We shall take the word Christianity in its largest sense as signifying that form of social order whose organizing force is the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. The key phrase here is form of social order. So let's look at that. Christianity is not simply a religion. It's something deeper and far more profound. If you think in terms of the concept of secular, for all of his adherence to a very biblical, very conservative faith, Gladden is transforming Christianity into something far more. It's ultimately a sociology. So, to some extent, Gladden promotes the secularization of Christianity as much as he promotes the Christianization of all of human cultures. So it's also particularly interesting that he doesn't mention a church. If we go back to the essay, whose organizing force is the life and teachings of Jesus. The corrective he's offering can be found down here. There is much in a man of which chemistry takes no note, and there is much more in Christianity which the dogmatist and the moralist cannot include in their systems. We're back to Herbert. Don't give me any systematic theology here. That is not going to work. The intellectual and ethical elements of Christianity are important, but the vital force, the spiritual essence, is the principal thing. Christianity gives us, in the words of Jesus Christ, a comprehensive statement, and now the two most important words, of religious truth and a perfect rule of conduct. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Now, somewhat of a critique in this paragraph, at least that far. If any man hath not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his, no matter how strictly we may adhere to Christian beliefs, nor how scrupulously he may follow the ethical rules of the New Testament, nor how civilly he may try to copy the life of the Son of Man, and conversely, one who has the Spirit of Christ ought to be counted as Christian. So again, we're up to don't give me the theology, give me the reality. And the goal is to build the kingdom of God on earth. All right, questions so far before we look at the next paragraph? Logical? Make sense? Okay. So this becomes the justification for his form of social Darwinism. It finds men in ignorance and seeks to enlighten them. It finds them in bondage to tyrannous appetites and riotous passions, and offers them the freedom and peace of virtue. It finds them poor and sick and sorrowful, and it serves their needs and cures their ills and wipes away their tears. It finds them afraid of that power behind nature. No accident that the words power and nature are capitalized, whose laws they have transgressed, and it assures them that his name is love, and that he is ready to forgive and to save them. It finds them shivering in a dark uncertainty on the threshold of the grave, and it lifts the curtain and shows them life and immortality beyond. Powerful statement. What do you think, Deanna? Anything stand out in that phrase or in that paragraph?
I thought it was kind of important when they say enlightenment, because that's more like of a mentality thing. So, oh, they might know about it, but to enlighten someone is very important. And so that people use, basically get to the root of it, but from the light of themselves to understand
Yes. And this becomes justification for going into any country and converting them to Christianity. So if you think about the deeper link he's making here, the kingdom of God on earth is possible. We have to transform society to be consistent with the life of Jesus as Christ. So the social engineering of people like Sumner, Ross, Spencer, Keller is tempered by the reality of the Christian message. The further implication is that from the very beginning, it's intended by God to be that way. So there is a fulfillment of divine purpose. There is a clear higher good, a clear moral justification for this. Questions, thoughts? Is this making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I have one question, because like this right here, this is very similar to what they say in church, like to live a Christ like life, and every day does that, or something like that. So then how, well, besides the social engineering and stuff, because I understand that part, but how does this like directly connect to like this social
social engineering?
yeah.
Okay, great question. As a Christian,
your duty,
exactly.
share your culture, share your everything, share your religion with those less things.
Right.
Or anybody doing any other religion that isn't Christianity.
That's right.
So then we're in a sense, well, I guess kind of how you said, well, in a religion like perspective, how you were talking about how the Caucasians are kind of like superior over the other religions, and Christianity was really superior over the other religions.
Mm-hmm.
And like the job and duty to go out and convert people with like the approach.
That's right. No, you're doing fine. Say everything you're thinking.
My immediate thought from what we just read was that it gives Caucasians a hero complex. And I thought that basically justified their need to go out and basically take over and impose everything and get rid of whatever else that they had, unless they for some reason wanted to keep.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of typified by a comment Albert Schweitzer made. Schweitzer was a late 19th, early 20th century German theologian, medical doctor, spent the bulk of his life in Africa. And I'm going to paraphrase what he said. I'm sure it's not quite accurate. But he said, "The Negro is my brother, albeit my younger
That's
brother."
exactly what we said. We studied on history.
Yep.
He died there,
Yes.
and somebody else was sick to find him because they wanted to ship him back to
Germany.
because that's where he was born and that's where he should die. He shouldn't have died on their land.
Mm-hmm. So it cultivates a different kind of racism.
Mhm.
People of color are my younger brother.
Let's not forget that the younger brother, like his, I don't know if it was like considered his best friend, but he was the one who carried his body all the way to the dock so that he could be shipped back to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They didn't go together.
It doesn't mean that Schweitzer wasn't loving. I'm sure to dedicate his life at that time in history, it took an immense amount of love. It's more that attitude of the younger brother that becomes the issue.
Mhm.
And
That's more of a Western type of thing. In a sense, but if my younger sibling, if you bring my argument or something, I'll be like, well, that's the younger one. So, because I'm older, I should get this or I would get this because I'm older. But when it comes to looking at that in ways, it's
yes, I'm more mature.
I just think he saw himself as like a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And so teachers most of the time know more than the students. So
Mm-hmm. So part of what's particularly interesting about Gladden is that he turns Christianity outward. It's not about simply praying on Sunday. It's not simply your personal relationship to God. It's embodying a divinely given responsibility to bring the kingdom of God to all humans for all time. So he links spirituality and social activity. This becomes effectively the beginning of the social gospel. So, if we put it in slightly different words, Christianity isn't a religion, simply a religion. It is a way of living in the world that is intended to be transformative. If we were to look more closely at what he says, we are taken back to the Sermon on the Mount and to related comments. I was hungry and you fed me, I was naked and you clothed me. So for Gladden, it's not enough to say you're a Christian. You have to embody Christian activity in the world.
mm-hmm.
By your fruits shall you be known. All right, are there questions so far? Is this making sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. But this is also where it begins to go south. How you embody Christian responsibility now becomes the question. What specifically does that mean? So, for example, if we go back to our diagram again, William Jennings Bryan will take this in a very different direction. No use for science, fundamentalism, and evangelical. But he's going to take the same concepts that we just saw to a more radical racist conclusion. He will equate for the separation of the races. So we're back to the conversation we had about him, or multiple possible theories of evolution. By the way, to go back momentarily, that second theory held that people of color were the end of the process of evolution. These are going back to when we talked about the two theories of evolution. One, Ham.
Yeah, gotcha.
Whereas whites are the true sons of Adam and not the result of evolution. I've not read enough of William Jennings Bryan to tell you whether or not he espoused this, but I think that clearly this is consistent with his position. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, let's go back to the diagram. I'm not completely clear as to what the motivation was or how it happened. But initially, William Jennings Bryan was Republican, then became a Democrat. And at least in the early part of the 20th century, the Democrats represented the more conservative position, especially on race. Sometime between the death of William Jennings Bryan in 1929, it flipped. They reversed their positions. But liberal Christianity, I guess one of the questions we ask or should ask is the extent to which liberal Christianity really represents a departure from social Darwinism. if you think ultimately about what it purports to offer, it's chapter and verse of Washington Gladden. Gladden can't be separated from Fiske. And it makes me wonder, is it possible that diversity is another form of racism? Or think of it as potentially segregation. Should I elaborate more on that? Okay. So the point that we're making is by structuring a world based on difference. So I'm effectively going back to Fiske, Gladden, and the racism of the 19th century. I am placing people who are not like me in that position of being my younger brother along the lines of Schweitzer. And sometimes it's almost implying there's no value in coming to a common culture. The assumption of difference is inferiority, not equality. The assumption is inferiority, not equality.
Well, so that's a good question. Well, in your opinion, do you think that people taking the time to, I guess, celebrate diversity and try to push out for more diversity, do you think that just makes like the racial segregation and racism worse?
I do, because I think in the end, when we start talking about isolated experiences that are not understandable by people who don't share them, then we're effectively locking the world down. If we go back to a comment I made yesterday in philosophy, there's a fundamental difference. Yes, sympathy is born in my feeling sorry for you. But empathy is born in my ability at some level to experience what you've experienced. It may not be identical, but I know what it's like to be beaten. Does this make sense? Mm-hmm. If we proceed on the perspective that Darwin was right about sympathy, then we're always going to come back to a hierarchical world based on race, power, and money. It doesn't make me feel equal, it makes me feel better. And if we look at if you think about social welfare in the United States, there's an incredible amount of resentment on the part of people who are wealthy. One of the most common comments I hear among my conservative friends can be summarized like this: They don't deserve it. We hear words like lazy, unmotivated, and we know that the welfare system is inherently punitive. But I feel sorry for you. So when I do something for you, I feel better about myself. If anything, while social welfare in the United States clearly made Marx wrong, we have not had a communist revolution. It doesn't make the world better, and it doesn't improve the quality of life in our world. Does that make sense? And if you think about the relationship, which has been true for hundreds of years, between Christianity and the rich and the powerful, I can still feel that I am doing my Christian duty. But if the focus were truly empathy, it would not be about me, it would be about you. I feel your pain. I don't judge your pain. I don't judge your circumstance. I feel your pain and I want your pain to go away. I will do what I can to mitigate that pain. So, whatever Gladden intended, whatever Josiah Strong intended, the result was the intensification of the very problems that they were attempting to solve. Social welfare is a failure. It's a failure because the assumptions coming out of Gladden and Strong and the others prohibited it from ever being successful. Am I making sense? Mm-hmm. So even if we think in terms of Albert Schweitzer dedicating his life to medicine in Africa, it's tainted by the fact that he never acknowledged the African as fully his brother, only his younger brother. So the stratification that we've been talking about perpetually gets in the way of ending the problems that we're looking at. So in the last few minutes that we have, if we go back to the diagram, when we look at the World Council of Churches, the best they could do was talk about social justice. They never offered a meaningful alternative. Essentially, that's the failure of Christianity. Coming from a culture that's inherently hierarchical, male-oriented, and racist, its view of social justice ultimately fails to address the social problems we face. So if we take it a step further, it's why ultimately in the 70s it's going to move towards liberation theology. We can't find the wherewithal within Christianity to effectively reform society, so we're going to become Marxist. Well, we've seen how well that's worked also. So before I sum things up, since we only have a few minutes left, has this been helpful? Thoughts, questions?
I feel like it was easy for me to ask this question, so I feel like I have more to talk about, but then not even with the Christianity, just like with the issues of racism and diversity and those topics. I felt like what we're talking about is easily relatable to what we see in our world today, and how we can bring that back to the root causes which are the bigger influence.
Thanks. A comment about the Death of God movement. The goal of the Death of God movement was to reduce Christianity or to separate the theology in Christianity from its ethics. And for a short period of time, if you think about the civil rights movement, the rise of modern feminism, forcing Christians to be socially active, it was marginally successful. By 1970, it had all but